Slavery is defined as the ownership of humans as property. Oftentimes, slavery entails some form of involuntary servitude that the person is not free to avoid or walk away from. In other words, you are being forced to do things against your will for the benefit of someone else. A slave is treated as a mere object to be used and does not own their body or their labor, but rather it belongs to their owner. They are no different from a robot, a tool, or a beast of burden in this regard. Typically, when we think of slaves, we imagine the master has 100% control over everything that might otherwise belong to the slave. However, this is hardly ever the case in reality, as such a situation would be psychologically intolerable to anyone, brewing bitterness and resentment until eventually the slave revolted and turned upon their master, rising up in violent insurrection. Thus, historically, slaves were often given limited autonomy and possessions as a means of placating them and preventing them from standing on their rights to self-ownership, to trick them into thinking their condition wasn't that bad, and in fact that they were better off as a result of their own bondage. Many were often given benefits and privileges as a means of further subduing them and engendering loyalty to the master. The so-called house slaves, as Malcolm X so eloquently put it.
The house Negro could afford to do that because he lived better than the field Negro. He ate better, he dressed better, and he lived in a better house. He lived right up next to his master in the attic or the basement. He ate the same food his master ate and wore his same clothes. And he could talk just like his master. Good diction. But then you had some field Negroes who lived in huts, had nothing to lose. They wore the worst kind of clothes, they ate the worst food, and they caught hell. They felt the sting of the lash. This was the difference between the two. And today you still have house Negroes and field Negroes.
In modern times, we understand that slavery is evil, that it's immoral to control 100% of a person's property, because controlling 100% of a person's property means they're a slave who works not for themselves and their loved ones, but for someone else, their owner, and that this person's mere existence is wholly dependent upon the mercy and compassion of said owner, which oftentimes falls short of the mark or is totally absent. More often than not, the owner isn't merciful or compassionate at all, but rather violent, abusive, manipulative, greedy, exploitative, and dehumanizing, treating their slaves as objects rather than people. After all, slaves are objects and property. Do you treat your toaster as your equal and give it full rights? Do you even treat your dog that way? No, you don't. And we'd regard someone that did as having something mentally wrong with them for humanizing things that aren't human. But the reason slavery is evil is because people aren't toasters. They're living souls with rights to life, liberty, and property. We understand that taking 100% of a person's labor, wealth, and property is slavery. However, at what point does it stop being slavery? 50%? 20%? 75%? In theory, we would agree that any amount of control over another person's property is slavery, right? That's so long as the person in question has not freely and voluntarily entered into agreement and consented to turning over their own property, or if they haven't otherwise committed a crime, such that seizing their liberty and their property would constitute an act of restorative justice. Aside from these two instances of contract and crime, any and all claims made against a person and their property would constitute an act of theft and slavery. We're all in agreement here, right? So we agree, then, that you are entitled to exactly 0% of your fellow man's property, and they are entitled to exactly 0% of yours. No one has the right to take someone else's stuff against their will. Such a moral code is so simple that even a child can understand it, and often we instill this lesson to them. At the same time, if we do not have that right, can we delegate it to someone else? I might not be able to rob your house, but can I hire someone else to do it for me? No, of course not. We understand that this would be aiding and abetting in theft, inasmuch as if I had done it myself, that I would be just as guilty of holding them hostage as the person holding the gun. Does it matter whether I turn around and give that money to charity? No, it does not. If I live in a community of 1,000 people and one of them has $1 million, which they acquired legitimately and morally in this case, would you say that it's moral for me to steal from that person and give all 1,000 of us $1,000? 999 of us are happy with the outcome. That's just democracy, right? And the lone individual is simply being greedy and refusing to share what he has. No, of course not. We would agree that's a terrible system, a corrupt and criminal system that violates individual human rights, and it cannot stand, even if the other 99.9% are made better off by it. It cannot stand because of the evil and immoral precedent it creates, to say nothing of the practical reality that this lone millionaire wouldn't stand for such a thing, but would likely take their money and go elsewhere before being fleeced for milk and meat. Thus, we cannot steal or enslave. We cannot ask others to steal or enslave on our behalf, no matter how seemingly virtuous the ends are. So then, why do we allow the government to get away with this? They are, after all, our representatives, meant to act on our behalf and carry out the will of the people. It's why we elect them, to do our bidding. And of course, no one elects people to do things that we ourselves think are evil, right? So when the government comes to your door and takes your money, your property, your home, your body away, when they take the fruits of your hard-earned labor away, and give it to someone else and call it virtuous, are they not likewise engaged in an act of systemic theft and slavery? How is delegating this power to them any different than if a handful of your fellow citizens got together and paid some random street bug to do it? To rob and abuse you, and call you a selfish, greedy bastard for refusing to be extorted. You might say, well, we consented to it because we all voted for it, and I'm fine paying my taxes because I like what's being done with the money. And that might be well and true for you, but clearly, not everyone wanted this. Many of your fellow citizens would like to pay $0 in taxes, and they voted against such theft. So if they don't consent, are you fine allowing them to opt out of the system and to pay nothing? If you aren't, then how is that any different from you hiring a thief to take their money? How are you any different from the slaveholder exploiting them for your own benefit? A slaver who then turns around and says, look at all the money I'm donating to charity. Clearly I'm such a good person. Never mentioning that the money they raised was off the backs of other human beings who never had a choice in the matter. I know you think you're a virtuous person who's doing their part, and don't see what you're doing as theft or exploitation. If anything, you probably see them as shirking their duty, right? You see people who don't want to pay taxes as being criminals and antisocial. You might say, it's not theft, since they're getting some benefit from it, which is paid for by all of our taxes. Alright. What if they agreed not to take any such benefits? Can they opt out then? If they don't take any public welfare or handouts, but have to pay their own way, and sink or swim on their own merits and the sweat of their brow, will you allow them to opt out then, at least in principle? Never mind whether it's practical for them to do so, whether they can get by without using the roads and whatnot. That's their problem, and it's a decision they have to make for themselves, whether they're willing to pay the price for living in a civilized society as you see it. Do you agree in the abstract that they have the right to withdraw if they turn down benefits? If not, then how is this any different from the house slave who defends his master's exploitation because he or she is personally benefiting from it? You do realize that, right? That the house slave who accepts benefits and privileges is likewise benefiting from slave labor, both their own and that of their fellow slaves, particularly the field slaves who work out in the hot sun doing bitter work while you sit at home in relative comfort. You still have to work, of course, and no one is doubting that your life is hard, but your work is not as hard as theirs. The master favors you, for now. But given enough time and the right conditions, he won't hesitate to turn on you when you cease being an asset to him. The house slave is not a good person. Yes, they're still a slave, and thus a victim as well, but they are perpetrating the very evil that afflicts both them and their brothers and sisters. They are being bribed with their own labor and property, and that of others as well, with tainted fruit and blood money to prop up this corrupt and immoral system. They are happy to do it because of the privileges they receive, and thus they cannot allow the field slaves to dissent or object or to leave, because if the field slaves realize they're getting a raw deal and leave, that means the house slaves who remain behind will not remain in the house for long. Rather, the master will transfer them out to the fields to fill that void, and turn these house slaves into newly minted field slaves. After all, why should the master soil his own hands? That's what slaves are for. And what's the point in owning slaves if you have to do everything yourself? He doesn't like having to do housework, which is why he bought you. But he likes doing field work even less, so he'll turn on you if he has to before doing it himself, because you're nothing but an object to be used in his eyes, and he has no qualms about selling you to the highest bidder, or even throwing you out with the trash once you've served your purpose. Again, do you treat your TV and your microwave with compassion for serving you faithfully all these years? No, you do not. Why should the master soil his own hands? Why should the elites and the political class sully themselves with manual labor when they have you to do it for them? When they grow fat and rich off your property and your hard work, and you are all too happy to defend them because they throw a few scraps your way? Because they put a roof over your head, which you built, by the way? Because they give you a hot meal, which you cooked? And you thank them for allowing you a bowlful after they've eaten most of it. You fear the whip. You fear losing what little you have. You fear being thrown out of the house and having to work in the fields like a dog just to make back half of what you currently get from the master. You fear having to work that much harder for what you currently get for free from the government, never realizing it was your own labor that produced that wealth in the first place, which was stolen from you and given back with a bow as though it were some divine gift. You aren't taught any of this, because it doesn't benefit the master for you to be well-educated and self-sufficient. It doesn't benefit the political class for you to know where your money is coming from, to think for yourselves, and so it never occurred to you that you might have something better. The idea that you might be free, that you might get away from this place, and go on to become your own master, and build something for yourself, and own 100% of it, beholden to no one. That with a little bit more effort in the short term, you might retire to a comfortable life in your golden years. Right now, that seems like a luxury belief to you, if it even crosses your mind. Except it doesn't cross your mind, and that's by design, because this system of theft has no qualms about bribing you to keep the racket going. It's a small price to pay to keep you in line, and they fill your head with fear towards the world outside these walls. Your fear and your greed keep you docile and controlled. And make no mistake, the poor can be greedy too, for we all want more for less if we can get it. Who wouldn't, after all? But the reality is that you can have better than what you're getting right now. to live like the master if you're willing to take a risk and do the bitter work required to make it happen. That sounds hard and painful. Certainly harder and more painful than putting up the little bit of work your masters ask of you right now. All they ask is that you keep the system going and tell your fellow slaves to shut up and stop rocking the boat. You've got a good thing going here, even though they're suffering because of you, because of your cowardice and sloth.
Some people have been on the ride for a long time, and they begin to question, is this real, or is this just a ride? And other people have remembered, and they come back to us, and they say, hey, don't worry, don't be afraid, ever, because this is just a ride. And we kill those people. Shut him up. We have a lot invested in this ride. Shut him up. Look at my furrows of worry. Look at my big bank account and my family. Has to be real. It's just a ride. But we always kill those good guys who try and tell us that. You ever notice that? And let the demons run amok? But it doesn't matter because it's just a ride. And we can change it anytime we want. It's only a choice. No effort, no work, no job, no savings of money. A choice right now between fear and love.
Instead of rising up to overthrow your master, you become his obedient lapdog, his bitch. You jump on command and roll over for treats, all while he laughs and is amused by your antics. In that respect, you're a little more than a circus animal performing for his entertainment. Are you a slave and a clown and a bitch? Is that what you aspire to be? Doesn't that feel insulting and shameful? Aren't you ashamed of being a house slave and living like an animal? Of being used like an object? I don't think that's how you see yourself, or what you want to be. I think you'd rather be your own master, and to have not just a hovel and some crumbs, but your own mansion full of the finest things in life, whatever that means to you. Maybe you don't care about being rich. You just don't want to be poor. And that's fine. No one does. And there's no dignity in poverty, despite what you've been told by people who benefit from you being poor. Who eat well and live high on the hog, while you struggle and starve in sickness and misery.
Let me tell you something. There is no nobility in poverty. I have been a rich man and I have been a poor man, and I choose rich every fucking time. Because at least as a rich man, when I have to face my problems, I show up in the back of a limo wearing a $2,000 suit and a $40,000 gold fucking watch. Now, if anyone here thinks I'm superficial or materialistic, go get a job at fucking McDonald's, because that's where you fucking belong. I want you to deal with your problems by becoming rich.
Perhaps instead, you don't want riches. You just want something comfortable and decent. Something you build for yourself that you can look upon with pride and honor and virtue in your heart. To do that, you must first recognize where you are and what you're doing. Or rather, what you're being made to do to your fellow citizens by supporting a system of taxation. You might be getting benefits from the government, and you might think you need them to survive, and that life would be terrible if this tap were suddenly turned off. But make no mistake, you are just as much a slave and a victim, being threatened and exploited and stolen from like the rest of us who work out in the fields. Naturally, you might be apprehensive and ask how you will continue to get by and to live without such taxation. If you were to join the field slaves in overthrowing your master because you recognize the evil in what he's doing, you've become so dependent upon him for so long that you've forgotten the power and skill you possess within you. That you are, in fact, more capable than him. He's got you convinced otherwise. He's got you convinced that you need him, when the reality is that he needs you far more, since he's utterly incapable of doing anything himself. After all, that's what he's got you for. He can't even tie his shoes without you. Can't even make toast, so you become his toaster. He can't sew, so you are his needle and thread. He can't wash, so you are his faucet. The master is bitter and envious and helpless, and that is why he becomes enraged when you try to leave, because he is nothing without you. You're there to cook and clean and scrub his floors, and sew his clothes, and take out his trash, and tend to his gardens, and to do the other things. You can do these things because you've been doing them all your life. Because you've been forced to, obviously, but at least you have some skill you can leverage to take care of yourself, or which you can offer to your neighbor in exchange for something they might have that you need. The master and his children are useless. They can't do any of that. Can't even dress themselves without you. You think you're dependent on them, but the reality is, they're dependent on you for their luxury and comfort, and even their survival. Without you, they die, and they know it. That's why they cling so tightly to you, and won't let you go. Won't let you be free. Why they lie to you, and try to convince you that you're a good person for staying, and that only criminals want to tear it all down and leave. They force you to turn on your brothers and sisters, when instead you should be joining in common cause against your political masters. They need you, but you don't need them. Once free, once you walk away from this plantation, this system of taxation, of theft, of forced servitude, things will be scary and hard for a while, out there adrift in the wider world for the first time. But you will have each other, your fellow ex-slaves, who all have skills of their own. People with whom you have a shared history and can build a community with, working together to take care of one another horizontally, rather than getting everything from the master top down. And you will have freedom. The freedom to go where you want, do what you want. The world shall be your oyster, the mound upon which you build your future, whatever your vision for it might be. Without taxes, we shall leverage our assets and skills together to take care of what needs to be done. To build the roads, the schools, the hospitals, the bridges, to pay for security and to collect all the garbage. Why do we need some useless bureaucrat to tell us what to do? We're the ones putting in all the work. We're the ones figuring out how to make society function, while they sit on their asses sipping sweet tea and smoking cigars from the porch, occasionally glancing over, cracking the whip, and telling us what bad little creatures we are because we won't obey their petty edicts. The slaves are getting uppity, they will say. Not only do we not need them, but the things we'll create by ourselves will in fact be 1,000 times better, 1,000 times more moral, and they'll be ours, 100% ours, with any excess going to these useless eaters that once called themselves our masters. At least, if we're feeling generous that day. And we might well be feeling generous, but it shall be our decision to make, and our money with which to make it. The political class have forgotten that we are the masters, and they are our servants. They're here to serve us, not the other way around. To serve the public, as dutiful public servants should. They've forgotten the sting of the whip, and what an honest day's labor looks like. They grow fat off our tax dollars, while we work like dogs, who don't even own the full fruits of our labor. It's time to change all that. It's time we rise up and throw off the shackles of taxation and welfare dependency, to come together and support ourselves for once, and one another, and reclaim our birthright to the American dream, which the political class have stolen from us. It's time to make America greater than ever, and build a future of freedom for all.